to the Old Testament book of 2 Samuel, chapter 21. Second Samuel chapter 21. The title of my sermon tonight is Rizpah upon the Rock, or A Strange Providence. Have any of you ever noticed that sometimes providence will knock you down, and while you are down, it will kick you in the ribs? Sometimes the providences of God are bitter, they are hard, and yet they are the providences of God nonetheless. In the sermon tonight, I want to help you to see the strange providence in the life of this lady named Rizpah. Rizpah upon the rock. Have you found the text? Let's begin at verse 1. Am I hearing somebody besides myself? Are y'all hearing?
It's the guy that's Sid. He's translating. He's translating in Spanish.
Well, you settle down back there, Sid. He was cutting cartwheels back there, and y'all didn't know that. All right. Had I started yet? No.
Verse 1.
All right. Then there was a famine in the days of David 3 years, year after year. And David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered, "It is for Saul and for his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites." Then the king called the Gibeonites and said unto them, Now the Gibeonites were not of the children of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites, and the children of Israel had sworn unto them. And Saul sought to slay them in his zeal to the children of Israel and Judah. Wherefore David said unto the Gibeonites, What shall I do for you? And wherewith shall I make the atonement, that ye may bless the inheritance of the Lord? Then the Gibeonites said unto him, We will have no silver nor gold of Saul, nor of his house. Neither for us shalt thou kill any man in Israel. And he said, What ye shall say, that will I do for you. And they answered the king, The man that consumed us and that devised against us, that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the coast of Israel, let 7 men of his sons be delivered into our hands, that we may hang them up before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord did choose. And the king said, I will give them. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. But the king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bare unto Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Michal, Saul's daughter, whom she brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Meholathite. And he delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them in the hill before the Lord. And they fell all 7 together, and were put to death in the days of harvest, in the first days, in the beginning of the barley harvest. And Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for her upon the rock from the beginning of harvest until water dropped upon them out of heaven, and suffered neither the birds of the air to rest upon them by day, nor the beast of the field by night. And it was told David what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done. And David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from the men of Jabesh Gilead, which had stolen them from the street of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hanged them, when the Philistines had slain Saul in Gilboa. And they brought up from thence the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son, and they gathered the bones of them that were hanged. And the bones of Saul and of Jonathan his son buried they in the country of Benjamin, in Zelah, in the sepulchre of Kish, his father. And they performed all that the king commanded. And after that, God was entreated for the land. Isn't this an amazing story from the Word of God? Are you interested? I have 3 items in my lesson. First, I want to give you the historical circumstances. Secondly, I want to speak of the honorable character of Rizpah. And thirdly, I want to give you some hallowed conclusions that can easily be drawn from this passage. Do you remember the story of the Gibeonites? It was told first in the book of Joshua, chapter 9. The Israelites had been instructed to leave none of the inhabitants of Canaan remaining. There'll be thorns in your flesh. There'll be a reproach to you, the Lord had said. They have conquered Jericho. They have captured Ai, and the fear and the dread of them has fallen upon the inhabitants of Canaan. The Gibeonites dwelt there in Canaan, and they devised an ingenious plan. They selected a small group of emissaries and dressed them in old clothes. They gave them old shoes, dried molded bread, and these emissaries came to Joshua and the Israelite army, and they said, "We are from a far country, but we've heard about you and about your God, and we've come to make a league with you." And Joshua said, "But how shall we know but what you dwell here in the land?" And they said, "Oh my, look at us. Our clothes were new when we left home. This bread was freshly baked. Make a covenant with us." And Joshua did not inquire of the Lord. He made a covenant promising that he would not destroy the Gibeonites. Shortly thereafter, he discovered that he had been deceived. And some of the men in his army rose up and would have slain the Gibeonites then and there. But Joshua said, "No, we cannot. We have sworn before the Lord, and we cannot go back." So they made the Gibeonites to be servants. They would draw the water and chop the wood for the Israelites. And this arrangement persisted for over 400 years. But when Saul, the first king in Israel, came to the throne, for reasons not given in the Bible, he began to kill many of the Gibeonites. Now, the Bible scholars quibble regarding his motive. Some say that Saul was a despot and he enjoyed all of the carnage. Others say that he's trying to make up for his earlier debacle when God had sent him to destroy the Amalekites. He was not to keep any of the spoil, nor leave any of them remaining. And he did most of what God told him, but he kept the best of the cattle and the sheep alive under pretense that he had offered them in sacrifice. And he kept Agag, king of the Amalekites, as a trophy of his victory. And when the prophet Samuel met him as he returned from the battle, Saul proclaimed, I have done all that the Lord my God commanded me. And Samuel said, what then meaneth this lowing of the oxen and this bleating of the sheep in mine ear? To obey is better than to sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. Some of the scholars say he's trying to make up for this earlier delinquency. Other scholars attribute a more noble motive to Saul. They say that he is returning to the original command to leave none of the inhabitants remaining. Regardless of his motive, this much we know: he breached the covenant. He broke the promise. And 30 years after the death of Saul, when David is on the throne, God sent a famine, and it persisted for 3 years. And when David inquired of the Lord said plainly, this famine is for Saul and for his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites. Now in our passage, David has gathered the leaders of the Gibeonites before him. He is seeking to placate and appease them. He says, what can be done to make up for this atrocity? And they said, we don't want any money, and we don't want you to kill anyone on our behalf. What we prefer is that you deliver into our hands 7 of the sons of Saul. He's the one who perpetrated the crime against us. Give us 7 of his sons, and we will hang them up before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, and we will be appeased. And David has agreed. He's taken these 2 sons of Rizpah and the 5 sons of Michael, and has delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites. It's along about the middle of April, at the beginning of the barley harvest. And they hang these boys and leave their bodies suspended there until the fall rains come in October. These are the historical circumstances. Now let me talk to you for a while regarding the honorable character of Rizpah. Do you remember Rizpah in your reading of the Scriptures? She had been married to the king as a concubine. She had been among the royalty and the aristocracy in the land. She had enjoyed many privileges and had tasted all of the dainties of the land. But she has experienced great and unusual disappointment. She has character that has been fully seen and manifested in these great disappointments of her life. Her husband has died. Do you remember how Saul died? The Philistines wounded him in a battle, but he did not die. And so fearful was he that they would torture him, he impaled himself in an attempted suicide. He impaled himself on his own sword, but he did not die. And when a young man passed by, Saul said, draw your sword and thrust it through me, lest these uncircumcised Philistines abuse me. When they discovered the bodies of Saul and his son Jonathan, the Philistines hanged them up in the street of Bethshan. Later, the brave men of Jabesh Gilead, who had owed Saul a debt of gratitude for more than 70 years, in an unusual act of bravery, came and stole the bodies of Saul and Jonathan and brought them to Jabesh Gilead. And there, 20 miles west of the Jordan River, they buried the first king in Israel. Rizpah has not attended a funeral. She has not had closure to the death of her mate. How can one articulate the sorrow and the grief of mind that a person experiences when they lose their mate. But that's not all. This lady, Rizpah, has been sexually abused. The captain of the host for the Israelite army has been publicly reprimanded for sexually abusing these concubines of Saul. How can you describe the horror that a lady experiences when she is violated in such a fashion as this? Are you folks alarmed at the onslaught of sexual abuse in our own nation? Are you concerned about the onslaught of child sexual abuse in our culture? I've got some down-home thinking about that. I believe that when a man has been adjudicated and found to be guilty of sexually violating a small child, and the judge gives him a 60-day jail term with mandatory treatment, I personally believe the judge ought to be hanged. That brings the judgment of God upon the land. Rizpah has been deposed from the palace. She is now dependent upon her two boys, Armoni and Mephibosheth, for her daily sustenance. Perhaps she has entertained a notion that David, the man after God's own heart, would restore her to some position of dignity in the land, and the horsemen ride up and dismount at her gate, but instead they take hold of her two boys, the objects of her affections, and they commence to drag these boys away. And when she says, "What's this about?" they say, "Stand back, lest you lose your own life also." And she collects a couple of items and she follows them at a safe distance. And she watches in abject horror. She watches in disbelief when they come to the hill in Gibeah of Saul. She watches as they hang her two boys and their 5 cousins. She waits for what seemed for hours, until at last the soldiers move away and leave her boys suspended there between heaven and earth. It's then and it's there that she commences this vigil. She spreads sackcloth upon the rock, and during the daylight hours, when the vultures would swoop down to tear the flesh of her boys, she rises up and drives them away. And in the midnight hour, though she is exhausted from lack of sleep, when the jackals of the forest would come to tear and devour the flesh of her boys and their 5 cousins, with discipline that she had never known before, and with courage and sheer determination, she rises up and she faces them and she drives them away. And she does it day after day, day after day. She watches as their flesh emaciates. She watches as their flesh drops from their bones. She watches until their bones have bleached white in the noonday sun. Neighbors come, perhaps family members, and take her by the arm and turn her around and commence to tug at her. "Come on home with us now. There's nothing more to be done here. We have wept with you. We have grieved with you, but it's over now. Come on home. Don't be delusional. Come on with us." But this mother will not relent. And she is not delusional. She does not suppose that she can restore their lives. She has this one glimmer of light, this one ray of hope in her heart even yet. She believes that even yet she might be able to give them a decent burial. She might even now be able to give them a noble interment, and as long as there is this glimmer of light, she will not relent. I submit for your consideration that this is honorable character. God bless Rizpah, and may God be pleased to raise up a new generation of Rizpahs in our day. Wouldn't it be something if God raised up a new generation of parents in our own day who realize that there are vultures circling above, waiting for just the opportune moment to swoop down and tear and devour our children? Parents who realize that there are jackals waiting in the dark, secret places, just waiting for an opportunity to pounce, to tear, to devour our youth and our children. Wouldn't it be something if God sent a revival that caused parents to be keenly and unusually aware that while their children are yet alive, they as parents have no greater responsibility than to bring their children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord? Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't it be something if God started here in this church in these days and raised up a new generation of parents who believe that it's more important for their children to be acquainted with the patriarchs of the Old Testament and the apostles of the New Testament than for them to be acquainted with every video game Hollywood can produce? Wouldn't that be something?
Yes.
Wouldn't it be something if God were to raise up a new generation of parents who believe that personal holiness and purity and righteousness of life are more important than academics and athletics and accolades? Wouldn't that be something? God give us some Rizpahs in our own day. Are y'all getting this?
Yes.
Is this making any sense at all? All right, put that aside. You see how quickly I'm moving through this sermon? There's 2/3 of it already. And now I want to talk to you about some hallowed conclusions. And perhaps I ought to caution you at this point. There are several of these. Are you able? All right, here's the first one. Sometimes God may send natural calamity as punishment for sin. It, the famine, is for Saul. Now don't come up to me after the service and ask me about Hurricane Katrina. I don't know. It's the business of the preacher to speak where the Bible speaks, and the Bible didn't mention Katrina. It's my business to tell you that God sometimes sends natural calamity as punishment for sin. You'd have to be an exegetical, homiletical magician not to see that in this text. It, the famine, is for Saul. Now, regarding natural calamities in recent times, one would have to be unusually naive, if not biblically ignorant, to at least raise the question concerning the matter. Is that fair enough? Now, number 2, when God sends judgment, it is fitting, it is appropriate, it is proper for His children to inquire why. David inquired of the Lord. I would suggest, however, that David himself would have been better served if he had not waited 3 years. At the first glimpse, at the first hint of God's displeasure, the saints ought to fall upon their faces and inquire of the Lord. Number 3, the wheels of justice may grind slowly, but they grind nonetheless, and they grind exceedingly fine. I cannot answer the question, why did God wait 30 years after the death of Saul before He sent the judgment? Is that not a germane question to ask? Why did he do that? I do not have the answer. I can tell you this, that the judge of all the earth will do right. I can tell you this, his ways and his thoughts are higher than our ways and our thoughts. I would ask you this question, however. Why should you and I be willing, even anxious, to enjoy the privileges and the advantages and the benefits that have accrued unto us from previous generations and not be able to accept some of the consequences for their mistakes and their sins? Does that make any sense? Number 4. Sometimes children suffer because of the sins of the parents. In the Decalogue of Exodus chapter 20, we have these words, "For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me." Now let me tell you something about these 2 boys. They are 1st generation descendants of Saul. These 5 boys are 2nd generation descendants of Saul. But they were depraved and they would have died. They weren't going to live forever. It's appointed unto men once to die. They would have died. But the reason they died this infamous, untimely death, the reason they were hanged was the direct consequence of their father's sin and their grandfather's sin. Well, I can't tell by the way you're looking at me whether you're getting this or not. Do you want me to go back and repeat every single word of this? All right, conclusion number 5. Providence is personal, and yet providence is far bigger than any one person. Providence was personal to Rizpah. It affected her at the deepest levels of her being. It affected the sum and substance, the wool and warp of who she was. She wrestled with those tough questions. If God loves me, why has He allowed this to happen? Why do the righteous suffer? If God's in control, why doesn't He do something? Lord, have you not taken into consideration all that's happened to me already? Is it not enough that my husband has died, that I've been sexually abused, that I've been deposed, that I was depending on Armoni and Mephibosheth for my daily sustenance? Lord, what am I going to do now? How will I pay the utility bill? How will I even put groceries on the table? Lord, where are you when I need you the most? Now listen, if you have never been forced by your own circumstances to wrestle with those tough questions, you ought to be thanking God. You are highly blessed and favored. You see, providence is personal, and yet providence is far greater than any one person. And Rizpah had to go back and read Jeremiah chapter 18 again. Thou art the potter, and I am the clay. Mold me and make me after thy will while I'm waiting, yielded and still. Now don't come up to me after the service and remind me that Jeremiah hadn't yet been written. I know that. I'm just simply telling you that sometimes we've got to understand that we are simply making a cameo appearance in what is a much larger drama. Yes. And it's not about us. It's about God. It's about sovereignty and providence, carrying out an eternal plan. It's about justice. Number 6. Sometimes parents suffer because of trouble with their children when the parents are not culpable, when the parents are not to blame. It's highly unusual, in my opinion, that these two principles would be juxtaposed in this one passage. On the one hand, children suffering because of the sins of the parents, and on the other hand, parents suffering unspeakable sorrow because of trouble with their children when they, the parents, were not to blame. You'll search the Bible in vain for one scintilla of evidence that Rizpah ever sloughed off, was ever delinquent or negligent as a parent. It wasn't her fault. It was Saul's fault. It was the fault of the father, the grandfather. And yet this mother, though not culpable herself, experiences unusual sorrow because of trouble with these boys. And if that's not enough, it also happens today, doesn't it? Have you ever known of it happening? Sometimes a child is born to a godly family. They have many advantages and privileges. Their parents take their responsibilities seriously. They seek daily to instill biblical principles and promises into their children. They bring them to the house of God with regularity and faithfulness. And yet those children grow up and become older teenagers or young adults, and for reasons that mystify their parents, they take a left turn. And they go out into the world to follow the flesh and the devil. Have you ever known of that happening? Has it ever happened here at this church? But if that's not enough, the enemy comes, the accuser of the brethren. And here's what he does. He says, it's your fault. It's no wonder your daughter's in the predicament that she's in. You knew better. You knew that your daughter would be vulnerable in that venue. You should not have allowed her to go. It's no wonder your son is in the trouble he's in. You were too harsh. You were too strict. It was your way or the highway. Are you listening? And the enemy will beat you up. And he'll disarm you and disable you and destroy you. You have to be discerning. And you have to be mature. And you have to go back and retrace your steps. You prayed for your children. You received them as a gift from God. Go ahead and admit it tonight in case you've never done it before. On your best day as a parent, you were imperfect. Can we all do that?
Yes.
Can we just get a resounding amen right here and create some common ground? You and I parent imperfectly. And there's enough blame to go around. Right? I'll answer that for you. Yes, Brother David. There's plenty of blame to go around. And yet, you did not teach your children to drink beer. You didn't teach them to use methamphetamines. You didn't teach them to smoke marijuana. That was the furthest thing from your mind or your heart for your children. The last thing on God's good earth that you desired for your daughters is that they'd be promiscuous. It may very well be that in this room tonight there are parents or grandparents who in recent days have wept themselves to sleep, worried and anxious because of trouble with their children or their grandchildren. And I tell you, sometimes the hardest thing on God's earth that you're ever called on to do is to realize that you can't do anything but pray and pray and pray. And recognize and acknowledge the sovereign God of your salvation. And wait on God to turn them around, to turn them toward home, turn them toward heaven, turn them toward the church. And I tell you, beloved, God can do that. God does that every day of the world. And He can do it for you. God help you to trust Him. Now, number 7. Is that right? Yep. Character is not made in a crisis, it's manifested. Beloved, if you keep on living, one of these days you are apt to face a crisis in your own life. If you want to remain steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, you'd better develop that kind of character today. Character is not made in a crisis, it's manifested. Number 8. Sometimes a child of God will have their greatest influence in the midst of their deepest disappointments. Who would have ever dreamed that Rizpah would have had such influence? Would you look at verse 11? And it was told David what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done. And David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son and buried them in the sepulchre of Kish his father. For 30 years, David has been negligent. In the first few weeks of his administration, David should have sent an envoy to Jabesh Gilead to retrieve the bones of the first king of Israel. You bury the king, even if he's a Democrat. Even if he's a Republican. That struck fear in some of you. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. I intended all along to say Republican too. He may not be of your political stripe, but if he is the king, he's God's appointed leader. And you bury the king. Now granted, you need to bury some of them deeper than the others, but you bury the king and you do it with pomp and circumstance. You do it with dignity and nobility. And for 30 years, David's been negligent. Who'd have ever dreamed that Rizpah, this concubine, would have influenced, motivated the king to do something he'd been negligent about for 30 years. Now, is there anybody in this room but us? Can we talk? Now, you notice how I'm just kind of sitting up here relaxed, just propped up here on the arm of the chair, leaned over, leaned forward just a little bit. You notice this? I want you to do that, would you? I want you to pretend that you and I are out in the woods sitting on a log. You're on one end and I'm on the other, and we're just talking about revival. I want you to lean forward. Now, if you won't do it, I'll just keep on preaching. Now, it's up to y'all. Just kind of lean out here and we're going to talk. Now, are you aware that if revival were to come, some of God's children may have to go back 30 years and undo some of the mistakes they've made? Do you know what Baptists are famous for today? It's no longer pie and ice cream socials. We're famous these days for getting enough people together that we can choose up sides and have a big fight. A little group will get their feelings hurt over some piddling matter. Seldom do Baptists fight over anything important. And little gray-haired ladies who make the best fried apple pies you ever tasted will become meaner than a junkyard dog. and they will give the preacher a cussing right out here in the parking lot. And they'll get really pious about it, and the first thing you know, a little group of them will pull out, and they'll go down the street a few blocks or down to the next crossroads, and they'll crank up a new church. And they'll name it Emmanuel Baptist. God is with us. He's not up there. We left. And some of the old mossbacks back here at the church who've been sitting on enough cash, they could burn a wet mule with all the money they've got. They've got Walmart stock that they bought back in the 80s. They don't even know how many times it split. And they hadn't given $1,000 to God's church in 10 years. Now, if you're calculating, that's less than $10 a month. But now that Emmanuel crowd has pulled out, they'll get off with those big bucks and they'll start giving to the church. Now, it's not because they love Jesus or burdened for lost souls. It's because they don't want to run the risk of bumping into some of that Emmanuel crowd down at Walmart without having the privilege and the pleasure of being able to say, well, let me tell you this, since you left, our budget hadn't gone down a dime. Why don't you put that in your pipe and smoke it? Is that the truth or not? If you've been around Baptist life very long, you know I'm telling you the gospel truth. And there'll be this big cloud over the community. And the rhetoric is at a fever pitch. But 5 years goes by and things simmer down. And before you know it, Emmanuel has applied to the association for membership. And ere long we can gather at an annual associational meeting and be civil toward each other. And then 10 years goes by, and 20 and 30 years goes by, and God sends a famine. It's not a famine of bread nor a thirst for water, but of hearing of the Word of God. And when we finally get around to inquiring, God says it's because of the rancor and the resentment and the bitterness. Are y'all getting this? Now I want you to look at the flip side of this. Are you aware, beloved, that what you and I are doing today will have an impact perhaps for 30 years, either for good or for evil? Have you thought about that? That your actions and your attitude might have a negative impact on the kingdom of God for the next 30 years. Now, put that aside and do this. Now straighten back up and do this. Number 9. I warned you, didn't I? This is the last one. I want you to look at verse 14, the last half of the verse. And they performed all that the king commanded. And after that, God was entreated for the land. Now, beloved, I believe in the sovereignty of God. I believe that His providence affects every area of our lives. But having said that, I also believe that the sovereign God of the Bible can be and often is entreated by the actions and the attitudes of His people. And so I ask you tonight, have you performed what the king commanded? Are you up to date in your personal compliance with the will of God. Wouldn't it be something if God would be entreated for our land at this time? Wouldn't that be something?
Yes.
God have mercy. God grant it to be so.